Hi, I'm Margarita Noyes, and this is Spiritual Therapy for Spiritual Diseases. I'm working off of Father Paulo's notes, which were translated for me by students in my ESL immersion course. Father Paulo began this lesson with a little joke. A guy goes to the doctor and has some tests done because he isn't feeling real well. And he comes back to the doctor and says, "Okay, doc, what's happening? What's the matter with me?" And the doctor says, "I have some good news and some bad news. Which would you like to hear first?" And the guy says, "Well, why don't you give me the good news first?" So the doctor says, "You only have 3 days to live." The man says, "What? That's the good news? What's the bad news?" And the doctor says, "I got the test results 2 days ago." Well, this lesson begins with good news and bad news. The good news is we are created good. We're in God's image, God's likeness. You are created good. At the center of your heart is goodness. That's how God made you. What's the bad news? We are sick. This is the biggest problem that we have to face in our lifetime. Every one of us is sick. We have a tendency to sin. Sin pulls on us like gravity. It's a spiritual law that operates on everybody. You may say, "Isn't that a little pessimistic? That's not a good way to look at people." Well, we have to be realistic. Everybody sins. The smallest child, before it reaches 6 or 7 years old, which is when the Catholic Church says is the age of reason, the age when a child begins to understand the difference between good and evil. Before that, a child has a tendency to sin. Ask any mother. From the time babies are very young, they scream and cry in anger, not just because their tummy hurts, but because they are angry. Small children fight with their brothers. They refuse to do what you tell them, even if they understand what they are supposed to do. They tell lies. It's impressive. Children from a very small age have a tendency toward selfishness and sin. Beautiful little innocent babies screaming and kicking to prevent mommy from changing their diaper. People are born with a tendency to sin. There's a story from Native American Indians. In that story, there is an old Indian speaking to his young teenage, maybe 12, 13-year-old grandson. And he is telling the boy that inside the boy's heart, there is a battle going on between a white wolf and a black wolf. The white wolf is goodness and the black wolf is badness. And they are eternally fighting and struggling to gain supremacy over one another inside the boy's heart. And the boy says to his grandfather, "Which one will win?" And the grandfather says, "Whichever one you feed." Well, the truth is, inside of our hearts, there is a battle. But the white wolf has every advantage by nature. Number one, God is on the side of the white wolf. God is on our side. He made us. He made us to be good in his image. So that's number two. Our nature is on the side of the white wolf. Our nature is good. There's no reason in the world for us to end up evil. Nobody is created evil. Not even the demons were created evil. They were created good. If they became evil, it was because of their choice. So we have good news and bad news. We are good, created good in God's image, but we are evil with a tendency to sin, which is universal. It affects all of us. Modern man has many ways of understanding this. Modern man is kind of tricky and ingenious about this concept of people being basically good and yet having a tendency to evil. Modern man wants to believe that people are basically good, but they don't know how to deal with the fact that there is evil in people. They can't really deny it because it's too clear, but they have to explain it away. They have to justify mankind by blaming the evil on something. For example, a few years ago in Brazil, there was an election, and a criminal group named the PCC started taking hostages and setting buses on fire with people in them. And the presidential candidate at the time said, "These men are evil, doing evil things because they lack education." He said if they would be in school, they would not be criminals. So evil comes from lack of education. This is not possible. Father Paulo was a principal of a theological seminary. That's a school to train priests. Father Paulo was the principal for 11 years, and he noticed that the students and the teachers, and even Father Paulo himself, all had a tendency to sin, to do evil. And yet, these students did not lack education. They were the elite. They came from families where they had gotten the best possible education. They came from all walks of life, the best of Brazil. And yet, 100%, they were all sinners. Sin does not come from a lack of education. Before you can appreciate the good news of the gospel of Christ, you have to accept and embrace the bad news. The bad news is that we are sick and we are sinners, that we have a tendency within ourselves toward evil, and that it must be combated. This is a big problem in the world today. Now, I would like to tell you something that I have noticed. This does not come from Father Paulo's notes. This is me, okay? I have noticed in America. Everybody seems to think that morals and morality is relative. There's no absolute right or wrong. Whatever someone does, it's okay. We have to celebrate alternative lifestyles. Celebrate two people who are the same sex and want to marry. Celebrate when a person, whatever a person wants to do, it's okay. The only sin an American seems to be able to commit is the sin of intolerance, the sin of being judgmental or critical. People do not like you if you are judging them and criticizing them and telling them that they are bad or that their actions are not okay. People do not realize and aren't willing to realize that they are sick. And so, when someone comes along and offers them a cure, they are offended. Imagine this. Suppose you went to your wife and said to her, "Honey, I love you. You are beautiful. But here are some diet pills. Maybe you can lose weight." Do you think she would thank you? No, she would be offended. She doesn't want you to give her pills to get skinny. Maybe you say, "Honey, I love you. You're beautiful. Here is an appointment to go see a plastic surgeon. He'll fix your nose and fix your chin, give you plastic surgery so you'll look better, and maybe a little liposuction. Just a little. Then you'll be perfect." Will she be happy? No, she will be very angry. That's how Americans react when you tell them they need salvation. They say, "Who is God to judge me? God should love me the way I am." How would your wife like it if you came home at night and she has been working all day at her job and also taking care of children, cleaning the house? She's been working all day, and you come home at the end of the day and you say, "Honey, I forgive you." She'll say, "Forgive me? For what? I have been working all day. I have not done anything wrong. What do you mean, I forgive you?" And you might say, "Well, I forgive you because you haven't kept the house perfectly clean. You haven't made a beautiful supper. I forgive you for everything that you have failed to do." Will she be happy with you? No, because she doesn't feel that she has done anything wrong. So she believes you are wrong for forgiving her because you are judgmental. We treat God that way. In America, at least. We say, "God should love me the way I am. He should not judge me and criticize me. He should not be a snob. What's the matter with God that he goes around forgiving people? He is always offended by nothing." People do not realize they are sick, and they are not willing to believe it. But if you do not believe you are sick, you will not look for a cure. You must believe the bad news before you will value the good news. So I am asking you to think about this carefully, to meditate on it. Do you believe that people are basically good, but they all, 100%, have a destructive tendency toward evil and sin? Do you believe that you are also that way? Maybe you should stop the transmission of this video right now and think about it, because you cannot really go on with this course unless you are sure of that basic premise. So let us continue with our first lesson in this course, entitled Philautia. Let's begin to speak about Philautia. Now that we have accepted that we are sick, we need to examine the disease in order to find a cure. There was a monk, a theologian, in the 6th and 7th century named Saint Maximus the Confessor. He wrote a quote that I would like to read to you right now. He said, "He who overcomes with the help of God, the mother of all passions, Philautia, the love of self, will easily overcome all of the other passions. But he who is dominated by the first passion, Philautia, will be overcome and dominated by the others." This is an amazing truth. Sin is not just a million random actions that you can take that offend God, like the stars in the sky, or like the grains of sand on a beach. A million different possible bad things you can do that are all equal, that are just no, 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 no laws. Hundreds and thousands of them. Sin is not like that. There is an organization to it. Sin is not like a tree with a million leaves, all the same. Take a look at this picture. I've put it on my computer desktop, and I'm going to leave it there for the entire season of Lent. This tree I'm calling sin. The plant is called sin. It is a huge tree. Every piece of the tree, every leaf, every fruit, every twig, every branch, every bit of the trunk and the root is all sin. It all carries the DNA of sin. But there is an organization to the organism. There is a main trunk. Off of the trunk come three main branches. Off of each branch come 5 more branches or so, several more branches, and off of those branches come a myriad of small branches, all ending in twigs with leaves and fruit. Sin. The trunk is called Philautia. What does the word mean? Philautia comes from the Greek. 2 words, philos and autos. Philos means love. Autos means self. So Philautia means love of self. And St. Maximus says, this is the mother of all passions. And if you overcome this one, you will overcome all the others. But if you are overcome by this one, you will be dominated by all the rest. So if you can chop down the tree at the trunk of Philautia, the whole tree will fall. But if the trunk of Philautia remains, you'll have the whole tree. You'll have no success. You will say to Father Paulo, love of self is the mother of all sin. How can that be? Jesus said we are to love our neighbor as ourself. That means we must love ourself first. How can you say that love of self is the primary sin, the first sin? Well, let's listen to St. Maximus again. St. Maximus says that Philautia is an irrational love of self, an inordinate love of self, a crazy, stupid love of self. Philautia is a love of self against yourself. How can we understand this? Let's look at the example of a drug addict. Why does a person take drugs? They take them because they want to feel good. They want nirvana. They want an experience that reminds them of heaven. Everybody wants heaven because we were made for heaven. So they are looking for heaven. They're looking for heaven on earth. So they take heroin or some other drug. And as they take that drug, it goes into their brain, and while it is killing brain cells, it makes them experience pleasure. So they think they are in heaven. Maybe they are laying on the street. Maybe it's cold and they have frostbite and they're going to lose fingers. Maybe they are skinny to the bone, dying of hunger. Maybe they have bugs in their hair and they're dirty and they smell. And maybe they are in their own filth and waste, lying on the street, but in their brain they have pleasure. They think they're in heaven. Really, their body is in hell. And the only hell that they know is the hell of not having the drug. When the drug wears off and they have to get some more, then they know they're in hell. They feel every pain of the starvation, the bugs, the filth. They feel all that and more. They feel even worse, the craving for the drug. They are in hell, relieved temporarily by experiences of pleasure, but mainly they have put themselves into hell. This is Philautia. This is a love of self which kills you. It's a crazy love of self. Father Paulo also has a nephew whose name is Lucas. And when the boy was 6 or 7 years old, he had meningitis. This is an infection in the lining of the brain, and it gives you a terrible headache, and it can kill you. And when the mother took the boy to the hospital, the doctors thought he had meningitis, but they weren't sure. So they needed to do a spinal tap to confirm the disease. That involves putting a needle in the bones of the neck and drawing off some fluid so they could test it to make sure it was meningitis so that they could give the boy the proper medicine. But this child would not let them take the spinal tap. He screamed and kicked and cried, and he refused to allow the test that would save his life. And they had to bring in strong nurses and orderlies to hold him down by force so that he would, he didn't allow it, so they could take the test by force. This boy loved himself enough to avoid pain, but he did not love himself enough to accept pain in order to save his own life. We all do this. I know I do. I would rather die than have severe pain right now. Do you do that? We all do that. We have a love for self, for our body, which does not understand and take into account the long-term good. We have a love for self which is short-sighted, and a love for self which ends in destroying ourselves. Jesus said, whoever loves his life and tries to save it will lose it, but whoever hates his life and loses it for my sake, for Jesus' sake, will gain it back. So Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. But he also said, whoever loves his life will lose it, but who hates his life will gain it back. So you have to put them together. When Jesus proposes that we take up our cross and follow him, he is not making a suggestion. Oh, I think you would enjoy going this way. No, nobody enjoys a path of pain. What Jesus is doing is he is recommending a cure. It's like if you go to the doctor because you have breast cancer, and the doctor says you need a mastectomy, chemotherapy, and radiation. And after that, you will be cured. The doctor is recommending a path of pain. You will have a breast cut off. You will have chemotherapy, which makes your hair fall out and you throw up. You will have radiation, which makes you sick. But after that, you will be cured. We were born to love, but we don't know how to love, in spite of the fact that the poets have been writing about love for millennia, and that the movies are all about love, the popular music's all about love, but we don't know how to love. Jesus taught us how to love by taking the way of the cross. But we don't want to follow him because the way of the cross is a way of pain. Philautia, irrational love of self. We will never find happiness unless we follow a way which includes pain. The first law of Philautia is that we run toward pleasure and away from pain. And many people think that happiness and pleasure are the same thing, but in fact they're not. If happiness and pleasure were the same thing, then a whorehouse or a brothel would be a happy place, as Father Paulo pointed out in his speech. But we all know that a place like that, a whorehouse, is a place of terrible despair and desolation. The pursuit of pleasure brings us to despair and desolation. Happiness comes from loving, because that's what we were meant to do. But loving does not really have to do with pleasure. It has something to do with our spirit. How many of you have ever been happy after a hard job that made you very tired but very satisfied? Imagine a mother who works all week at night after her hard day at her job to prepare for her son's birthday party. And on Saturday morning when the party is happening, at the last moment she's combing her hair, putting on makeup, because all week she worked for her son and she never thought of herself at all. And she's bone tired and exhausted, but happy because she has loved her son and she has done a great job. Pleasure is about the body. Happiness is about the soul, and it comes from loving. Not only Christians see this. Sigmund Freud, a famous psychoanalyst, spent all of his life trying to prove to people that they should pursue pleasure, like sexual pleasure, outside of the laws set up by God. And in his last years, when he was approaching death, he discovered that unlawful, free sex brings a kind of death, a kind of despair. The word is anatos, death. And his last work was trying to figure out why eros, love, sexual love, leads to anatos, death. He never figured it out. After him came another psychologist named Francois Dolto. She said that desires are not something that we really ought to get or achieve. Desires are something that we say. Now, when Father Paulo explained this, I didn't understand it at first, but I understood it later. First, you have to understand that there is a difference between a need and a desire. A need is something like sleep. You will die if you don't get sleep. Or food, or water, or air to breathe. All these things you will die if you don't get. But something like sex, for example, is not a need. It is a desire. People say, I have needs. I have sexual needs. I have to see to my needs. But really, sex is not a need. It's a desire. And let's see. And according to Francois Dolto, desires need to say something. They need to have a significance above and beyond the material. For example, a poet has a desire and he puts it into poetry. His poetry speaks and it says something beyond what he is talking about. A painter has a desire and he puts it into paint and it speaks, it says something. It has meaning. Dancers, same way. All artistic types of expressions, they speak of something beyond the act itself. Sex has to be that way. You look at the animals. Animals can come together for sex and then separate, and it is satisfying and good. That's all it needs. You don't need love for an animal to come together. Just let them come together. They're happy. The female becomes pregnant. It's all good. People are not like that. For people, sex is not a need. It is a desire, and it must say something. It must have significance beyond the act. Even moderate psychologists, the most moderate, know this and speak about it. Sex devoid of higher meaning kills and brings despair. People who treat sex like animals, who just come together promiscuously, they end up unable to enjoy sex. In fact, they end up unable to perform. They end up impotent in many cases. For sex to say something, it must be sacred. That's the Christian term, sacred. That means set apart for a spiritual purpose. Now remember, Father Paulo says sacred, not divine. People tend to make a god out of sex. Sacred does not mean divine. People make gods out of lots of things. Sex, food, money, power. When you take these things and make gods out of them, they turn into demons. But these kinds of desires, they should be sacred. They should be set aside for a spiritual meaning, a spiritual purpose. They should point us to God. When sex is sacred, it is done God's way. It is within the bounds of holy matrimony. It is open to life and children. It is characterized by true love between the partners, not forced on one another. When sex is done this way, it is an expression of something more than the act. It is an expression of our submission to God, to the kingship of God. It says God is creator. He created this. We do it in his way, and we are blessed. The sex act in marriage, done God's way, points us to God. It is sacred. Desires must be sacred. They are not something that we are supposed to just take any way we want. And if we do, it ruins them. It leads to despair. Philautia is a love for self which works against our best good. It works against self. Sex is just one example of how Philautia has us pursuing something we think will make us happy, but it really is a trap. It ends in death. This is the first law of Philautia, a love of self which is crazy and irrational against ourselves. There are many more examples. Look around you. Now, Father Paulo said this, not me, so it's a little crude. But Father Paulo asks, why are our young men, teenage boys, spending every night jerking off, masturbating, while watching internet pornography? Why are our adolescent girls, our young daughters, our sweet girls, wearing black and putting black makeup on and cutting themselves with death in their face? Why do they cut their bodies to push back a spiritual pain? Why are they in so much pain? Why are so many of our young adults going to psychiatrists to get antidepressant medication so they can cope with their lives when their life contains nothing that's actually wrong, no catastrophe or illness? They should be happy, but they're so miserable in their worldview that they need drugs, psychoacting drugs, to deal with their depression. Why do we have so many people taking illegal drugs, killing their bodies to get a little pleasure for their bodies? We have alcoholics who destroy their brain, they destroy their liver, they destroy their family, their marriage, in order to have a little happiness tonight. Why do we have so many young people chasing sex like the animals? Sex with every member of the opposite sex, and then even members of the same sex, multiple people, just to try to feel a little good. Why is this the way our culture is? Ask yourself the question. It is because of Philautia, the trunk of the tree, the mother of all sins, the mother of all passions, the irrational, crazy, loco, idiotic, stupid tendency to love yourself in a short-sighted way that will lead you to death and despair. This is our first lesson in the course Spiritual Therapy for Spiritual Illness. We need to understand our sickness so that we can find a cure. The name of our sickness at this point is Philautia, inordinate self-love. This is the primary passion. This is the trunk of the tree. So, I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll look at lesson number 2.